you can write GI Joe and we're just killing Cobra and nothing matters, or you can write about real people making real decisions and that's what is drama. I don't want to read that's for me that's where it gets to the fake versus the real, because I think putting a character in a real situation where they have to make a difficult decision that is especially similar to something historical, that has some real weight, and that's going to really lead your reader to think about what these people are doing in these situations. And to me, that's what elevates a GI Joe story. You've got your GI Joe stories, and then you've got your actual stories that are entertaining, but also deal with the reality of being a soldier. That's the thing to me that elevates that to the next level of really saying something and helping people feel that.
Drop troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. Free action in the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Short stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
All right, today we're talking about rank, and rank in terms of we're going to get a little uh how the sausage is made and talking as authors, but what rank means in a military science fiction story, how important it is, how authors should think about rank as it applies to character and plot progression, and then getting into any these days you get a contract, it's going to be 3 books no matter what, but quite often those 3 books hit and your publisher wants 6 book, 3 more books and then 3 more books and 3 more books. So if you are designing a character to progress over the course of a series, how fast should you move them up in rank? And also, a general is not as cool to read about as a PFC in the trenches typically. So I think that's a lot. So why don't we why don't we start with just rank in general and maybe some thoughts about rank and how rank sets apart a military science fiction story, and maybe things people aren't thinking about when it comes to rank. Anybody got ideas to
Um,
come up with?
I got a thought, and it actually occurs to me. I was just talking with my daughter about uh, her joining the military, and I was talking about different things, and a thought occurred to me that um, not all rank, and specifically enlisted rank, not all rank is the same in terms of what they do or what their responsibilities are. In terms of like as comparison, like if you compare an E9 or an E8 in a normal position, let's just say in the Air Force or even in the Army, that you would look at that rank and go, yeah, they're upper management, right? They're still enlisted, but they're dealing with more of a supervisor organizational role. But then I thought too that when you get into, I know we've talked about special forces and special operations, you look at some operators and they're, master chiefs or master sergeants or senior master sergeants or whatever. And so that rank is the same, like they're E8s, but they're not technically like upper management. They're still operators. And uh, and in terms of customs and courtesies, that stuff is kind of the same. But as far as operational responsibilities and actual work, um, it can vary depending on what job they have, depending on what service they're in. Um,
And it's very
I think,
unique. Like that
yeah,
that kind of
exactly.
turns everything on its head. I think if you get people that have only studied maybe global war on terrorism or read about it or experienced it, and they're really excited about these operator stories and they're used to, these, I don't know, sergeant first classes jumping in and doing stuff. Like, well, from my experience in the Army and for what I would call the regular Army, a sergeant first class is a platoon sergeant, and so their experience, if they're not a platoon sergeant, there's others that'll look at them like, well, you're a staff puke then, or like there's a lot of kind of nuance, I think, in that. And
That's
even,
different across services too.
yeah, yeah. Air Force could be, I guess my impression of the Air Force, although I feel like this has changed over time as it gets smaller and smaller, but you could have people that are technical specialists that have a higher rank that didn't get pushed out like they would in the Army,
I'm doing my impression of the Air Force right now, sitting at a desk
sitting
at
in
a
a chair.
computer.
Ah, the chair force. That's right. My buddy who's a Marine gives me crap about that all the time. And I said, hey, man, we got paid the same amount basically. And I got air conditioning and I slept on a bed and I had the best chow halls in military service that you could have. And you slept in a tent and ate MREs. So who got the better deal? Because we're both in the same place now.
Well,
But you're right. I think a lot of people just look at enlisted as they're just kind of the worker bees, and the officers are the ones in charge. But again, like you look at the unit, there are some units where the officers are the operators, right? Like they
Yep.
are the ones that are doing the work. I mean, I think the biggest example of that is in terms of pilots.
Yeah.
Like pilots are the officers are the ones that are flying the planes. Now, in the Army, that's different sometimes for like helicopter pilots, because a lot of those, I think all of those are actually warrant officers, even though I guess you could have
Not all
officers.
of them.
Um,
There's usually like the Apaches are flown by lieutenants.
Officers.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
I have a
Yeah.
You
I
rarely
have a
meet
friend-
a you
I have
rarely
a friend
meet
who was
pilot
a
who will officer.
Apache pilot. I went to college with him. He flew combat missions up until he was, I believe, lieutenant colonel.
wow.
Yeah.
So I had a friend
Yeah.
who was, I mean, he was a Black Hawk pilot. This was during Iraq, but he didn't want to make captain because when he made captain, he was going to get pushed out to like he really had to fight for flight hours, and
Oh,
he was
right.
going to get all the suck without getting it be able to fly. You know, he basically
Right.
became a logistics officer, and so yeah, there's nuance there. And if you're writing a story about Black Hawk pilots or whatever your equivalent is, I mean, somebody has to order bullets and give Article 15s, and if it's not going to be so that
But does
that
anybody want to read about that?
exactly. But
Yeah.
how? Well, I mean, Rick, you just did it. I mean, I'm working my way through Drop Trooper, and you did it in Drop Trooper, and I think made it relatively interesting. And Jeff,
Which did what?
let's see, this was just number 3, I think, and he's got a troop that of course wants to get drunk and fight, and he's threatening him with an Article 15 if he doesn't clean up his
Oh
act.
yeah.
Yeah. And Jeff, I'm trying to remember if Grimm had to give non-judicial. I don't think he gave. Well, I mean,
No,
there is the whole
he doesn't, because I don't deal with it in the books because he
Yeah.
refuses to allow his subordinates to push it up to the captain's mast.
Yeah.
Because the captain's mast, while it is equivalent to the Article 15, it is very damaging to somebody's career. And when you're on a boat like that, like I don't know if you guys ever got Article 15. I got 3 while I was in, and
Congratulations.
you know
You're all the way up to Article 45.
it's hard. It's hard.
Hey.
It's hard to not be resentful of leadership at that point and feel like you're being targeted, and not feel like you're being targeted. So so with Grimm, I read this book about command, and one of the things he does is he sees people pushing non-judicial punishment on spacers as seamen in the Navy today as a failure of leadership, that they're just passing the buck
Yeah.
for a problem that they don't want to deal with. And I got that because that was my experience with Article 15s, was that it's like I had a platoon sergeant where you step one toe out of line, Article 15. No counseling, no talking to you, no hey, this is how we do things here in this unit. Second day I was in the unit. Second day I was in the unit. I didn't know that there was a Saturday morning formation. I just got in the unit. I missed Saturday morning formation. I didn't know there was a Saturday morning Article 15.
They gave you
So
Wow.
the first time I meet the captain of the company and the first sergeant was in my Article 15 meeting.
Yeah,
So it
That's
was
crazy.
and I was a PFC. I didn't know anything
yeah.
at all. And so it was a terrible REMF unit. And I had just come from an infantry unit where everything was high speed, low drag. They were really cool. They took the work serious, but they didn't take themselves serious. And then I get to this unit that takes themselves serious, but doesn't take the work serious. And then that was also the place that called an alert formation Christmas morning. I think they issued Article 15s to everybody who didn't show up.
Wow.
That sounds like a
Only
congressional.
punishment I got when I was in was I got a letter of reprimand because I rolled my eyes at a lieutenant.
Man,
And
that sucks, man. I mean, I had to give 2 when I was in command. I had a guy that went through the motor pool and like punched 3 side view mirrors, and it was like part of
Was he on his motorcycle at the time?
No, he was just an idiot. Like this was a progression, and it was the kind of thing where we had tried corrective training on him, and he would just do stuff like this, and it's like, well, what else am I going to do? And then another one that's like popped hot for weeds, so that was like we gave him a
Well,
company
those are kind
grade.
of like a given.
Yeah, well, I mean, we gave him a company grade to start, and that was being nice to him, and then he went and did it again, and so he went. I got to actually escort him to Fort Hood in shackles. Our battalion commander liked to do that, and so it was a whole story
Wow.
with that soldier. But I think thinking about it, like something I haven't seen that just occurred to me, like I think there's always a challenge when you're progressing a character. They get to a certain point and they're going to be awesome. It's kind of a way you could nerf them is to give them give them some kind of punishment and knock them
Mm-hmm.
back and then show character progression. Because like what Jeff just described is like a crappy command that's like you could go from an awesome situation, you get transferred, like which is a military experience out of your control, you go to a garbage unit, they treat you like this, and then what are you going to do? It takes a lot. It's hard to deal with that kind of stuff and come back from it or find a way through it. I mean, that's one of the hard. I think that's something actually that civilians don't really understand a lot of times is when it's out of your control and you've got leadership that's garbage and you just are supposed to suck it up. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's that's not something most people deal with and get through it.
Yeah,
So
whenever anybody tells me they're thinking about enlisting, I'm like, well, maybe you should be an officer. And they're like, well, don't you have to go to college first? I'm like, yes, yes, you do. You do not want to be an enlisted person unless there's a field you want to go into that requires you to be enlisted.
You don't want to be an
Unless
officer.
unless they're going into combat arms. If they're going into combat arms, I'm like, go for it. It's going to be fine. But the rear echelon guys, in my experience, there was night and day between combat arms and rear echelon. The transportation units sucked. Supply units sucked. Um, Armory units sucked. You get infantry or rangers or even the signal units, awesome. But anybody. Well, this is back in the '90s, so it may have changed. But essentially, anybody who trained to see combat had a much different attitude than the people who trained to push pencils.
I mean, what I experienced is once we, went to war, it's like I totally experienced that. Like people with something to prove. Like the people that weren't actively engaged didn't felt like they had something to prove. You had leaders that felt they had things to prove. They had to inflate everything, make everything twice as hard. And we'd start deploying, and it's like, oh, holy crap! Now you're focused on an actual thing you have to do that's serious. And I found that stuff became less because we had an actual job to do, and then you'd rotate back, and people would realize how burned out people were. Um, but now I'm reading, I read stuff with, people currently in, and it's like the op tempo hasn't gone down since global war on terrorism ended. And it's like a lot of the leaders that came up through that it's like they've all got collective PTSD and are trying to maintain that op tempo when you might not need it. So there's this weird thing that I mean, and that's rank related as well. Like, especially you talk about officers, trigger pullers are going to be up through captain potentially. And then if you're not going to see the tip of the spear again, unless you get into a battalion staff of some kind. And even then you're not, major is the worst rank in the army or at least the army practically. And so few people go into battalion command as lieutenant colonel. Um, so, but I was thinking about when I kind of posed this question, I was thinking about also nuances of like when I enlisted, I went in as a PFC because I was delayed entry, which the Army at the time was really selling as this great thing. But then you hit basic training and you don't realize that everything's based on time and grade and rank. And if they can pin anything on you as the person who's outranks, the other idiots with you, now you're in charge
Right.
of those people. And if you don't
Yep.
have interpersonal skills to do that, like that's going to be tough. And I think that's one thing people don't see a lot.
Getting back,
That's so funny because in my experience when I went in was like they would do that, and the person who had the time engraved was an idiot. And all I could think of was like, this is like high school. Why is this guy in charge? You know what I mean? Like we're both the same rank. Yeah, he's got a couple of weeks on me, but like he's a moron. Anybody could see he's a moron. You know, and yeah, so
getting back to the
funny.
whole military science fiction thing, because I think we've drifted a little too far into
We're all-
just our current military experiences.
Yeah.
If you're progressing a character through ranks, there's a tendency, I believe, and I know what this is, it's to allow a longer series. There's a tendency to make a lot of the main characters in a lot of these books Mustangs, or people who've gone from enlisted through OCS to officer, because then you can start your series with them as a private and end it with them topping out at some rank like major or lieutenant colonel, and that gives you, like Jonathan Brazy's, I forget the name of the series. It's one of his earlier ones, Fleet Marine or Fleet something, I don't know. It's not a Sense to War. It's one before that. But he started out, the name of the book was Private. And Private, Corporal,
yeah.
Sergeant. He went. That was the title of all the books. And there is a tendency to do that for a longer series. But that brings back the question of what you were saying. If you don't know if you're writing a longer series, do you want to top your character out at like corporal or sergeant at the end of your series? Because that works in the beginning, I believe, of a series really well, to give people a ground up, bottom up view of what the military's like. But if you get to like book 4 or 5 in a series, I think you want your main character to have a more big picture of the war he's fighting in.
One of the
Well,
things
also,
that
you spend a lot of time in rank too. I know I've read a lot of books where people have a tendency to, like, at the end of every book somebody gets promoted, or they jump them up in rank. But especially with the officers, they're not getting promoted every other year. Let's see, it only took me 2 years to get to PFC, and then an additional year after that to get to specialist. But there was I knew specialists or E4s who took years to get to sergeant, and then a minimum of 2 years at Buck to get to staff. And so you got time to play. You don't have to speed through the rank progression. I know.
Yeah, but I think it's a plot device, though. By the end of your series, you want your main character to have like a big picture and have more power over what's going on.
Well, and progression is really
might want them to...
popular. But Josh, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that there's kind of different takes you can take on it, but there's also there's a lot of pros and cons to either the progression or lack of. In the books that I'm writing now, I don't envision a progression of rank in terms of growing the story. I'm kind of taking the almost Mark Greene approach to progressive storytelling, where he's very ambiguous about not age per se, but he doesn't, you're not jumping like years between events, right? And so it's almost like James Bond-esque, where he's always the same rank or position or whatever, and just the events that are taking place are just sometime, and there's not really there's not really a scale of this happened when he was a private, this happened when he was a sergeant. I think those things are good. I think one of the best examples of that are the core, I call them, like first 7 or 8 Honor Harrington books, where she starts at she didn't start as an ensign. I want to say she starts as like a lieutenant commander or something, and then kind of progresses up the command scale like that. And that was a pretty decent, I think, progression of her career. And if you're writing a book that's, career focused or that kind of focused, then that kind of progression is kind of mandatory in that kind of genre. But then, like we've seen with Honor Harrington, David's a great writer, but you get to where she's like a flag admiral, and then like most of the time Honor's sitting she's in a meeting, right?
Yeah.
It's not like she's not captaining a ship anymore.
And David loves his meetings.
Yeah. So you run into that aspect if you're
aspect of the story changes considerably.
Yeah.
It's no longer a space navy story. It's no longer a spaceship story. It's a
Political story.
running a navy political story.
Geopolitical.
Yeah.
Right.
And I
And
think
if
for
that's the
most
kind of
books,
story that you want to write, that's fine. But I think that if you're trying to write like, I don't know, I want to say grunt stories, but where the action takes place and you're following the characters that are like even Rick, what you're saying, where they become more involved and knowledgeable about the events, I think you could still do that without making them putting them in the back office like rear echelon or whatever.
no,
You just
I
have to
think if
kind of
you're
be
writing a
careful.
grunt story, you have to top out at captain. You can't really go much further than that.
Yeah, I agree, but I think also you can, unless you're doing a rank progression story, if you're just focused on the characters, you can probably, like you're saying, it takes time sometimes to go through ranks, but you can do multiple events and carry through without pushing them so high up the ladder. Or if they get high up the ladder, like we were talking about before, maybe they get punishment and they get demoted and now they're back in charge of, what they were doing before.
I guess
I
it
think the
depends on
story,
how long you want to take the series.
Yeah.
for sure.
If you're fighting a war and you're going to be in that same war, the same campaign for 12 or 15 books, you're going to get pretty high up in whatever chain you're in.
For sure.
Unless those books take place so real time, like one book is 30 days or something.
Now, there are
Yeah.
different jobs you can put people in as well, which is
Yeah.
something folks sometimes forget. I mean, I'm not super excited about staff, but there are ways that could be made interesting, or to have a character start as a staff officer or person on staff and put them. I mean, there are plenty of people in Iraq that found themselves in direct combat that were on staff, depending on what was going on. So there are stories that could give a different view on the campaign from that job.
Also, for instance, we were talking about operators before. People who are in special operations units don't get promoted as quick as others. And
True.
It's
It's competitive.
they're usually upper level NCOs, and they stay at whatever rank they're at for a long time, because a lot of what gets you promoted in the military is stuff that they don't check those boxes, because a lot of what they do is classified, and it's like, were you in a leadership position over a platoon? Well, no, not really.
Well, if you're in a highly competitive, I mean, that's the downside of Rangers, I would say, like, it's harder to get promoted. Infantry, it's a little bit easier, but my experience in air defense, like, a lot of people would leave infantry, they'd leave those branches and come over to air defense because you could get promoted faster. And
There's a high degree of burnout too with the Rangers
Yeah.
and that kind of thing, because you are high speed, low drag all the time.
Mhm.
And so I could see, like, in a sci-fi world where you have like even more specialized groups, because you're talking about space travel, you're not going to be moving thousands, theoretically not going to be moving thousands of people across multiple planets for training exercise, that you would have people staying in ranks longer, especially if you have any kind of technology where it takes time to get anywhere.
Right.
So, like, you'd have to take into account that someone traveling from Earth to Alpha Centauri, maybe that takes 2 weeks, and I can see in the future adjusting the time and grade to account for travel time. Otherwise, you could have somebody who's like, oh, hey, they went to Saturn and back, and now they qualify for 2 rank promotions.
Sorry, we don't
Well,
count
not
your
only
time in
travel
deep sleep.
time, but also
We don't count your time
well, I
in
was
deep
gonna
sleep
say
toward
that.
retirement. Like,
I was
basically,
gonna say that, but
guys,
sorry, go ahead, James. I didn't mean to interrupt
no, I
you.
was just making a joke about, like, we don't count your time in deep sleep toward retirement. So
Well, one of the other aspects that just occurred to me when you're talking about time traveling and distance, all that, like Honor Harrington, since I mentioned it, and I do something similar, and I know other people do too, but they have the prolong, which you're not living 90 years, you're living 300 years or whatever it is, right? And so instead of doing 20 years of military service, maybe you're doing 60 or 80, and that's just normal because their lifespans
and
are
that's going to
longer.
make rank progression a lot harder,
That's
because
gonna make
nobody's getting out of their rank.
100%. Yeah, 100%. So those are things to take into account too.
See,
I've
that's
got
a
a
problem, I think, that people don't think about when they're writing science fiction, and it kind of takes away from the verisimilitude for me. Is they will have faster than light travel and things like that, battle suits and all this stuff. and yet people aren't living longer or appreciably longer. And in reality, we're going to be living a lot longer long before we go faster than light. And if you have people who are living 300 years, it's going to change everything about society, and consequently everything about the military. You know, people aren't going to, you're going to have people who stay in the military for a long time, but you're also going to have people that drift in and out of the military in different periods in their lives. Like they served as an enlisted for 10 years, and then they go do something else for 20 years, and then they'll come back and go in the military again. You know, it's going to be an interesting situation that most writers in the genre don't seem to want to deal with very much.
Well,
Yeah,
and I think,
sure. I mean, because it's all like, you know, that's like the paperwork end of military sci-fi, and who wants to deal with that?
Hmm.
You know, it's
well, I
just,
think too
it's
that
not fun.
there, I think in at least the majority of the current and newer, a lot of people are just focusing on kind of the battle aspect of it instead of taking like the military as a whole entity and considering the multitude of different scenarios and just things that happen in the military. I mean, it's like we've all served, but how many and the majority of I think active duty members, I mean, they all served during GWAT, but think of like the majority of active duty that served before GWAT, and they didn't have any really wars to fight. There was no like, you know, you had Vietnam and Korea and all those conflicts and wars, but then you had a really long time where nothing happened and nothing was like they weren't prepared for it, they weren't ready for it, and there's several guys that served for 20 years and never went to battle and never went to war, and there's
Oh,
some
that's
kind
most
of
people. I'm a Cold Warrior. I got out not too long after Desert Storm,
yeah.
and that was Desert Storm, Panama, and Grenada was the only thing that happened while I was in.
I spent most of my time doing natural disaster stuff, which I think is an aspect of the military people often overlook too, which is fighting fires and, you know, showing up after earthquakes to clean up and
For sure.
provide food and things like that. The
Those they just aren't the fun things.
I don't know. I thought fighting fires was a lot of
It can be
fun,
fulfilling.
but
They aren't the things people write about. Let's put it that
No.
way.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
no,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
what I meant.
I
But
definitely feel like that when you're writing with your military sci-fi, you really need to have a good grasp on what the rank is going to be before you get going. Like what do you want this story to be about? Is this going to be an enlisted story? Is this going to be an officer story? I think the advantage to an officer story is you have more time. Officers just don't get promoted as fast as enlisted, so you know you're going to be a second lieutenant for a while. You're going to be a lieutenant for a while. You're going to be an ensign for a while. The
Well, and not just the promotion aspect, but also like just the I don't want to say this in and have it be taken the wrong, but the writing style should be different. Like if you're writing from an officer's point of view, you know, they're they're typically looking at situations as on the macro level, where an enlisted you're looking at a micro, like that's your job. You have one job and this is what you do. You fix the bolt here. And so your scope of things and honestly your mindset about things is completely different as an enlisted, a junior enlisted to senior enlisted to junior officer to senior officer. The mindset is different. And so what I try to do is make sure that I present that in the narrative, even just by their way of thinking is different. And I'm not saying that officers are more cognitively aware of things and more like, you know, more intelligent or just whatever, but the mindset and the way that they process information and process operations is completely different. And so if you're writing a junior enlisted and he's thinking about like some kind of logistical problem, that's probably not accurate to what you're writing about, because
the
most
junior
junior
enlisted thinking
enlisted
about a logistical problem would be like, why don't I have my warm weather gear?
100%, like it's localized to them. Like they're not thinking about battalion level logistics or company or squadron level logistics, unless you're the logistics officer, then or the enlisted guy there. So I think making, like you're saying, deciding on the rank that you're going to write about you should know what all the ranks are capable of and how they operate. But if you're going to write a junior enlisted story, make sure that you're focusing on what the junior enlisted focus on, um, and if you're writing an officer story, make sure you're focusing on the stuff that the officers are focusing on, because they are significantly different.
I feel like you can do both, though. I mean, a lot of the stories I think would benefit from going from one to the other.
Oh
You know?
yeah, like if you're having like multiple characters
Right.
and you're showing it from two different angles, 100%. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's interesting when there's both. When you see the officer and the enlisted, and they both think the other one is kind of short-sighted,
For
but they're
sure.
just looking at it from different perspectives.
Well, I think
I
the
love
author,
stories where you get like a blend of like what you're talking about, but also like kind of like I'm sorry to keep bringing up Honor Harrington. It just is the best example that I can think of off the top of my head. But like even in the core books, you had enlisted, then you had Honor and her officer level, but you also had occasionally like higher level stuff where you were dealing with the queen or the politicians or whatever. And so you got kind of a good blend of everything.
and I think understanding that difference
Oh, you
is
were waving. I thought you were going to say something. I
for
see
the
what you're
queen.
doing. Okay.
I
All
know.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and also that comes down to your writing style too. Because if you're writing first person, you're not doing that. But if you're writing third person,
100%.
it does, and like I do, it's a lot easier to bounce around like that. Like I've got, obviously Jacob Grimm is my main character, but I've got a chief, chief,
Redfern or Chief. No,
Chief of ship.
sure, I man, my brain, the
French.
cob on the
French
ship
lady.
is Chief Suresh, and she's
Remember the chief of ship thing?
yeah,
The
Chief
of
of the
boat.
ship. Gosh, that guy. I had an editor who redid Chief of the Boat to Chief of the Ship, but yeah. So I've got Chief Suresh, and she's got 24 years in service, and she's a chief petty officer. And if she gets promoted to Master Chief Petty Officer, she can't serve on a destroyer. She's got to go, serve on a battleship and be more of an instructor than a helmsman. And so she's always telling the captain, like, don't you do that to me. I thought you liked me. Don't do that. And so with rank, it's really interesting. It's like you have officers, they have a lot more rules they have to play by. Of course, you've got your enlisted who are always trying to break the rules. And then you got those NCOs who have found out all the loopholes in the rules and get all the assignments they want, things like that.
Yeah, warrant officers.
And
the rules don't apply to.
yeah, and then warrant officers, like I've got a warrant officer who flies Sarah, and Boudreaux, and the rules don't necessarily apply to her.
One of my favorite characters to write, although it's very short, was when I was doing in Drop Trooper. They were doing training in armor school on their battle suits, and you had these guys who were like junior enlisted, and they were in deathly fear of officers, and then the NCOs would bark at them, and then they come across these warrant officers who are the trainers at armor school, and they're like totally just chill. They don't give a crap if you salute them or say so. They don't care about what you're doing. They just want you to learn what you're being taught. And it was just funny, the reaction, writing the reaction of these junior enlisted who had just gotten out of basic training and they're in armor school and they're all like braced and everything, and the warrant officer's like, yeah, whatever.
I thought that's one piece of this we haven't talked about either is contractors, which that scene to me, Rick, if I'm thinking of the right one with the warrant officer who kind of gives important information about how to do something with the suit that then Cam does later or needs later. But like for us, like we worked closely with Raytheon, and so we had warrant officers, and then we had Raytheon contractors running around that would be like, oh, you can do blah 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 blah, and there's like back end of the the system showing you how to do things that you're not supposed to know how to do, and that was always kind of cool as well. And these are people that are outside the rank structure or they're retired, so they understand it, but they're outside it, and so they could tell you whatever they wanted. I mean, they worry about getting fired, I guess, but nobody's going to do that. So that's an interesting thing to play with as well, especially if as the author you need to give information in the story. That could be a way to do it that's not going to be constrained by the aspects of rank. And anytime you're dealing with tech, and realistically whoever's making the tech, there's probably going to be some kind of contractor or advisor or somebody that's there to make sure the stuff works.
What I thought, what I just read this in a book and I can't remember. It was this latest Gray Man book I'm reading, um, Sierra 6, and there's a very small sequence in the beginning of this book where this it's a CIA Grand Branch team and they're getting on a military transport, and which happens, you know, and there's uh contractors like you're saying that come and they do things and then you know they're secret or whatever. But what was interesting about this and what I kind of chuckled at is that they're on an Air Force transport, and the CIA guys are, you're in their perspective, and the load master is a chief master sergeant, an E9, which I thought was interesting because it's a pretty high rank to be a load master, but maybe. And it could be that maybe, you know, I could see a situation where he was maybe he's the chief enlisted guy of the section, and because it's such a super secret mission, they give it to him, and you know, but at the same time, they end it. He puts this thing in there where the chief is just like, giddy is the wrong word, but kind of, right? And the guy's like, oh yeah, he's probably gonna go tell all his buddies that he flew some CIA guys around. And while I could see that with like a junior enlisted, even maybe like a mid enlisted guy, if he's a chief, he's been around for a really long time. And if he's the one that's flying the CIA guys, my guess would be he's done it before, and he wouldn't be like, it would just be normal operation. Be that's something he does all the time. He wouldn't be excited about it, and he would understand the significance of the mission or the classified nature of whatever it is, right? Um, but like it's not a game. It's not a deal breaker for me. It's just like some of those little things are kind of what we're talking about here, and kind of why we're doing the show is because those little things are eh,
It's the difference between a great,
sometimes
like a book that gets
so,
it and a book that frustrates you, right?
sometimes they just don't ring true. And that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that the writing is bad or the book is bad, but if you had got it right, it would have made the book that much more. You know what I mean? Like,
I read this book. I read a military sci-fi book, and I didn't get past the first chapter because it was the first officer, and he was just like walking through the ship like he was on like it was a Sunday stroll, you know, talking to people, and nobody was acknowledging that he was an officer. I didn't even know he was an officer until he got to the bridge, and then they get under attack, and like the helmsman is an ensign, and she's all like, "Sir, we're surrounded," and she starts crying because you know they're gonna die, and like you're in space, you can't get surrounded in space, and why are you crying? I'm just like, it's like the writing was pretty competent in the technical sense, but like the storytelling,
right.
that was, I mean, just no truth in military there at all.
There is no crying in space.
No crying in space.
In space, no one can hear you cry.
I mean, I had a soldier that had a panic attack. Like, we found him in a closet. But it was, I think, like, what's the purpose of this? Like, one of the things that frustrates me in stories, I guess, and this also in military stories, is like, is the tension real or is it fake? And for
Mm,
me, that kind of response is fake. Like, I would much rather be there with the crew, being awesome, and then the tension is coming from constraints of their equipment or constraints of the situation, and how are they working to, you know, outsmart those things. I don't want somebody to just all of a sudden start crying or breaking down for a personal reason, because that's not fun to
right.
read. Like, I got that in my own life. I don't need to be reading about
100%.
that. So, um,
I
I guess
just
it depends
actually,
on
that's
whether
interesting that you mentioned that because I just read a book where and these guys write great books. I've always loved all of their stuff, and they had an opening sequence where this SEAL team gets ambushed, and a couple of them die, and several of them get injured. And I almost stopped reading it because the SEALs started like crying and sobbing, that they were shot or that their friends died or whatever. And I don't have any personal experience with SOCOM, but I've read enough, and I've read a lot of nonfiction about it and read a lot of novels that I know these people have done the research. And you know, just from my personal perspective, when that stuff happens, those kind of men don't cry, they get angry. And their physical response is completely different than what was portrayed in this particular book, and they get angry and they get more determined. And after the fact, maybe you have a moment when you're at home and you're sitting on your couch by yourself, and then you have a breakdown. But in the moment of what's happening, sometimes what somebody might think is, oh my God, his friend just died, he's gonna cry. No, unless that's the type of character that you're writing. Maybe if you have like a
I
female
don't think that,
hostage, or some kind of like some kind of non-operator, even like a computer engineer or something, maybe they would cry. But operators in that situation, they aren't going to do that.
I mean, I have seen footage, like news footage of, this wasn't operators, this was Force Recon Marines, but being evacuated after a battle in Iraq, where one of them was crying because of the dead guy sitting next to him in the helicopter.
For sure. Yeah, but that's not in the moment of the battle,
No,
right? That's
no.
after.
I think,
Yeah.
and that's a
We had
big,
Jack Coughlin, who was a Marine sniper, and he was probably at the time in the late 90s, early aughts, he was the most successful Marine sniper in the world. And he wrote a book called Shooter, and in it he talked about how when he was in Mogadishu and he'd be on a roof and with his team, and they call in fire support, and he'd start picking guys off. He'd see his scope was good enough that he saw their faces. And when it was all said and done, he'd go downstairs, he'd find a quiet corner, he'd give himself 5 minutes, and he'd cry,
Wow.
and then he would lock it down and he'd go on about his business. And I mentioned this once to some operator on a podcast, and they thought I was joking. They're like, "Oh, the operators don't do that." And I'm like, "Well, I mean, everybody's different, obviously. But I mean, like, taking somebody's life, if you're a good person, taking somebody's life, no matter how justified, is still going to get you."
100%. Yeah.
I think that's
And
important
I
character
know-
detail. And you gotta also, like, is that person gonna break if you were building up to something where they do break down eventually? I mean, that he's kind of taking care of himself in that moment. He's he's setting boundaries, he's doing what he has to do, and then moves on. Whereas somebody that doesn't
Yeah.
do that,
And there's going to be situations when you're in the military where, in the future, just like now, where things are going to go wrong. It's going to be a bad shoot, and somebody's going to die that shouldn't have died. And you got to be prepared to have your characters deal with that. I know in my books there was a point where the interceptor was chasing down a merchant ship that was running, and they ended up having to fire on it, and and just blow it up, and because it had a weapon system and it fired on them, and the weapons officer is a young kid, he was sorry, the weapons officer is a young kid, he's a lieutenant, and he had to deal with the fact that he's the one who pulled the trigger and blew the ship up that had nothing but merchants on it.
I mean, there are consequences. I guess
You're
that's the
muted,
thing.
Jeff.
Like, you can write GI Joe and we're just killing Cobra and nothing matters, or you can write about real people making real decisions, and that's what is drama that is ultimately kind of interesting to me. I mean, I don't want to read. For me, that's where it gets to the fake versus the real, because I think putting a character in a real situation where they have to make a difficult decision that is especially similar to something historical, that has some real weight, and that's going to really lead your reader to think about what these people are doing in these situations. And to me, that's what elevates a GI Joe story. You've got your GI Joe stories, and then you've got your actual stories that are entertaining but also deal with the reality of being a soldier or in the Navy or whatever. But that's the thing to me that elevates that to the next level of really saying something and helping people feel that.
But also bear in mind what you're telling the story about, because that entire subplot was dealt with in like 2 paragraphs. Because he had a conversation later on with Skipper about having done that. It's not something you want to meander on or drag out unless your story is about that. That was the thing that bothered me about the Hunger Games books. After the first one was amazing. I love that book. And the second one was kind of a retread of the first one, which is kind of normal. But the third one, she spent the entire book like in a closet giving herself painkillers because she couldn't handle the PTSD. She couldn't handle all the stuff that happened to her. And I was just like, you're in a war. You're in the middle of a war. You're actively being shot at. You're not going to be
Well, that
like
one's written for teen girls
running
too.
away, you know,
I mean,
and hiding in a closet and taking
Well,
drugs.
that's the thing with PTSD. Everybody that I know who's had it, and a lot of my friends have. It's not when they're being shot at that it happens. It's when they're at home and everything's quiet.
When they're not,
and you
yeah.
can think too much.
Because
That's why.
now it's quiet.
That's why so many people go back and volunteer to go back over and over again for tours, like during Iraq and Afghanistan, because the PTSD hits them when they're at home.
Well, Vietnam's the same way, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a drop trooper like Rick, you deal with the idea of dealing with war crimes and characters struggling with that in the midst of having to fight a war and
That's
win.
one of my favorite scenes that I've written ever, by the way, when the Tani have slaughtered those civilians and they've got these, and then they surrender, which Tani never surrendered, but these guys do toward the end of the war. And he's a lieutenant by that time, and one of his squad leaders says, "What do we do with these guys?" And one of his team leaders just starts shooting him.
Right.
And he knows he should stop him, but he just like turns around and walks out of the room.
Well, and
I love that line when this platoon sergeant asked him, when he comes out of the room, he says, "Were those Tani trying to surrender?" It's like, no, Tani never surrendered.
But it built up to that moment too. Like, he's been abused and he's witnessed. I mean, you buy it.
I mean, I think at one point he was trying to save those Tawny women, and then they attached bombs to all the, a couple of the armored guys, and people he knows are killed by them. And
right.
Yeah, so you did a good job. It wasn't like he just came out of the gate and was like, "Hey, I'm going to shoot them." I remember watching Platoon and being so angry at the way he handled it, because in Platoon, I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but
Yeah,
for
like,
sure.
everybody but Charlie Sheen's character is just a straight up, baby killer rapist.
What about that one sergeant?
They kill him.
Yeah, but I mean, he was
spoiler. They kill him.
He was not one of those
and
baby killers, though.
Yeah, and so it really pissed me off, because like, I was like, listen, I get it. There are bad people in the military, but do we need to really glorify and make movies about the bad people and why they're so bad, and then show it from the good person's perspective who doesn't really do anything to stop them? I mean, it's like reading The Watchmen, or I don't know if you guys remember Hill Street Blues back in the day.
Oh yeah,
it's just a show about corrupt cops. I'm just, why?
Hill Street Blues wasn't all about corrupt cops. There's a lot of good cops in that show.
But David Weber said something, going back to David Weber, he said something that really was profound to me at a conference, about how we have a moral responsibility when we're writing military sci-fi to not glorify anything above the rest. We should show the glories of war. We should show the horrors of war. We should show the glory of serving in the uniform, and we should show how sometimes it sucks. I tend to write with a more optimistic tone, and so I mean, people do bad things, but I don't dwell on it, and I don't go into detail on it, because it's just not the story I'm telling. But it is there. No one looks at those books and thinks, "Oh, he just thinks the Navy is perfect and being in the military is perfect." No, there's people die, and it's war, and they die horribly sometimes, occasionally senselessly, though I tend to stay away from that just because I feel like it's a crutch. And I'm not writing a real war. I'm writing a story that people are supposed to enjoy. And
right.
Yeah, and
right.
George Martin. And so it's important to remember the balance, like the real life, and with the fact that you're also trying to tell an entertaining story. If you get too much into real life, it stops being an entertaining story and starts being more of a documentary. If you get too much into entertaining story, it doesn't ring true. So you balance the truth with the fiction, and the best fiction is the ones that have a core of truth, in my opinion. since I said it, obviously.
Obviously, you're the only person who's ever said that, but no, that's
We're
absolutely it.
we've kind of like drifted away from the whole rank progression thing here.
Well, I
It
think this
happens.
ties in because there are different challenges at different ranks, and kind of the things that we've been talking about, like Cam Alvarez as a platoon leader dealing with that, like is different than Cam Alvarez, the PFC, who might have been the one that made that. Cam feels the weight of what should I do about this, which is a different thing than what the PFC might feel. But
Yeah, the
how
PFC is the one that pulled the trigger.
right, right, and you can tell different stories there. And for me, I don't know, the satisfaction of watching that progress over time, I enjoy that a lot. Because for me, like the progression of rank, because I experienced it, but also watching somebody, like it's always, I'm not gonna say it's like gratifying, but it's almost exciting when you hear about somebody that's like got promoted or is going in and starting that journey. Um, to me, that's like you just know all the kind of cool stuff and challenges and things that are ahead of them that I don't know, I love to read about it. So it's the kind of thing that if people do well, I really like to see it.
And it's not that hard to do well, right? It's not that hard to do the I think as a rule, mill sci-fi is pretty forgiving in the broader audience. Like there are some mill sci-fi readers that are, they're vets and they've been there and they've done that. They see that. And so if something doesn't ring true to them, they're going to, say something about it or knock the book down a little bit. But as a rule, mill sci-fi readers are pretty forgiving. And um, I think a lot of that is just based on like them watching military sci-fi movies because those movies take a lot of liberties with things and they might not even realize the things that you're doing right. Like the little itty bitty things that the actual vets are going to get. And so those kind of things I don't do to satisfy all of the readers. I just do that to get the very small niche of actual military vets that would identify this particular thing as true, or get the thing that's get it right. And for the most part, though, all you got to like reading the nonfiction military stuff is the best way to get a grasp on the perspective of a person at a particular rank, whether it's enlisted or officer, or even pilot or commander or whatever it is. Those are the best ways because it's firsthand information. That's easy research. You don't even have to find them. You just buy their book and read them. If you've got a friend that was in there, talk to them. But it's so easy
It's so
now,
much
especially with
easier
all the
now than it
other.
used to be.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times I've gone on YouTube and just done research to find these interviews with these guys because they're out
Yeah.
there.
I mean,
I
it used to
Rebecca
be-
had a client who wrote space opera, and he was
Yeah.
writing a new series, and she does covers, and he was doing a new military sci-fi series. The guy wasn't in the military. I call him a kid. He was probably 30, and he was telling her that his military sci-fi series, his sci-fi series, up to the point where it's selling, and she was like, "Well, do you like sci-fi?" He's like, "Oh yeah, I love sci-fi." Is that why you write it? He's like, "Oh yeah." And so, what's your favorite sci-fi book? He's like, "Well, I like sci-fi movies. I like
Right.
military movies." And
Right.
she's like, "Well, I mean, you don't read it though, so maybe that's not the genre you should be writing in." And he ended up switching to thrillers and it has been seen a lot more success and is very happy in that regard.
What I
Oh,
was going to
good.
say was that back in the 90s when I started writing this, it was so much harder to get any kind of exposure to military nonfiction after World War II, basically.
Mhm.
There
Right.
was some Vietnam stuff, but Vietnam wasn't really a source I wanted to draw upon that much because of all the politically charged stuff with it. And everything in World War II was a totally different kind of military than we had in the 90s. It was a
Right.
drafty military for a very limited war. So it was really difficult to find it. And special operations stuff was almost impossible
Yeah.
to get any useful information on for writing. So
I
mean,
think one of the
you had to know the people and talk to them in person, basically.
I think one
Yeah,
of the
so-
best resources I've found, and I'll say this and then we can wrap up if we need to, but I think one of the best resources that I've found in terms of a broad spectrum, like easy research, I call it, is the Sean Ryan show. And it's he was an operator, he was CIA ground branch, I think. And now he
I
does
love
a
his show.
podcast, and he does phenomenal interviews. They're long form interviews. He lets people talk. And you get such a variety, a diverse picture. He interviews operators, he interviews commanders, he interviews contractors, he interviews politicians. Like, to be able to hear these people talk for a couple of hours and hear how they talk and why they do the things that they do and their experiences, it's such a just a priceless resource that if you're not even if you want to make your writing better, check out shows like that. And you can search for an operator, you can search for the specific thing that you're looking for, but if you're just doing broad spectrum research, check out that show. There's a couple other ones that do really good interviews too, but those long form podcasts where he's talking to those people are amazing.
For heaven's sake, read a book.
Read a book.
Don't get all your stuff from movies.
Or read a book. Yeah. Do that too.
The
Do that
podcast
too.
is good too because it's nonfiction. But I mean, like, the people who come into writing having only watched movies, you really want to read it. Well, you want to write a movie, not a book.
100%.
Not movies. Write a book.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to say, Amazon has actually helped a lot with this. Like, there are a lot of personal memoirs that people are putting into Kindle that never would have been published before. That it might be kind of rough, but like I just found one from a lieutenant in World War II that went through Battle of the Bulge that was kind of a perspective I'd never seen. And then another one's one of my favorites is an FA lieutenant in Korea that is just this guy's memoir that he wrote. Like, literally, he got hurt and he wrote it like while he was in the hospital, and then his family sat on it for like 60 years and published it.
Oh wow.
And so it's stuff like that is great too. I think they're harder to find. Like, podcasts are definitely a great way. But check on Amazon too, because there's a ton of stuff there. So
For sure.
all right. Well, this has been a great conversation. If you have thoughts about rank, we'd love to hear it. Especially things about a rank that maybe you held, or even a service we haven't talked about. We tend to get kind of tunnel visioned into what we know. So I'd love to hear about things from the Coast Guard or the Space Force now. Like, what are they experiencing? I shouldn't do that. Like, the Space Force has an important mission. I just tend to like, I don't know. I would have joined the Space Force if I was 18 now. That's what I would be trying to do.
We need to get a wing commander from the Space Force.
We do. We need to talk to the Space Force so we can get some actual info on it. But we'd love to hear about that. So check us out.
Yeah, if you were in the Coast Guard or one of the branches we weren't in, reach out to us. Leave us your thoughts on the differences and what your perspective is.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So well, the link to our Discord.
Try to convince us why the Coast Guard is really part of the military.
There
went all our Coast Guard views,
I know.
Rick.
All the Coasties. I mean, should they all be DEA? I don't know. The Coasties, I mean, they see action. So
I used to tell people, I don't know if it's still true, but I used to tell people when I was in the Army, they'd say like, well, the Coast Guard's in the military. And it's like, they're part of the Department of Transportation, not the Department of War. So no, they're not military. But I believe they're now in the Department of War, especially since they're basically the tip of the spear on the war on everything.
Right.
Yeah.
You want action, you want to be consistently get action, join the Coast Guard and be a jumper or one of those guys who like drives the fast boats down there in Colombia. Yeah.
Yep. They do stuff and they do it all the time. So check out the Discord. We'd love to talk to you, and we will see you next time. So thanks for hanging out with us. All right. See y'all later.
See you.
Load up, troopers on the hit and jump gate. Military sound